Okay, so let's get started. My name is Pat Brim. I'm the Director of Public Sector for Gimmel. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, our Federal Records Management Race to the Finish. A couple of housekeeping items as we get started today. Today's webinar is being recorded. A link will be made available to the attendees in the next couple of days. If you have any questions, please use the chat or Q&A boxes, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Today, we're going to be focused on how we can support federal agencies as they race to the finish to become compliant with the M1921 directive. We're going to take this from discussing requirements to actually showing you solutions that you can utilize to address the directive. So DocPoint, QAI, and Gimmel are long-standing partners with a wealth of experience, as is summarized on this slide. I'm not going to go through all of these bullets, but there's a great synergy between our organizations to address really the full life cycle of content in support of your agency's missions, from assessing your needs, capturing the content through retention, records management, disposition. And we spend a lot of time in federal buildings and around the Beltway and around the country. And we found over the last several months that we're being asked a lot of the same questions by a lot of the same clients around M1921 compliance, how we're going to get there, etc. And so that really became the driver for us putting on this webinar today. This is the crew that will be presenting. So Russ Savvy, who's a senior sales engineer with Gimmel, and Scott Money, Director of Operations for DocPoint, will be taking us through a live demonstration of the solution. And Mike Radigan is the Vice President of Sales for DocPoint Solutions in QAI, and he'll be really setting the stage for the overall conversation. Mike will do that by reviewing the specific M1921 challenges that the agencies are facing, a strategic framework on how we can help you become compliant, and review the paper-to-cloud conversion implementation approach that we can offer to support your efforts. We'll then move into a live demonstration showing you converting records, digitizing records, and moving them into electronic form where we can manage it through records management. We'll top it off with some of the benefits that we hope to provide, as well as a Q&A. And then lastly, we're going to offer you an offer that you could take advantage of between our organizations to help you better understand how you can become compliant. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to carry us forward.
Great. Thanks, Pat. Just a little bit of housekeeping with Quality Associates and DocPoint. So Quality Associates has been doing this type of work for many, many years, and we've established a narrow readiness center, which we'll provide to you as a follow-up as part of the PowerPoint deck. It's also good to note that Konica Minolta owns both DocPoint and Quality Associates. So as we talk about headquarters offices here in the Washington, D.C. area, or offices across all 50 states and beyond, Konica Minolta has a global reach. So if it's a matter of where files exist, whether they're in the D.C. metro area or around the country, we have over 100 offices to support you. So moving on to the agency-specific challenges, I think it's important, and as Pat has alluded to, many of the agencies we've spoken to, and it's been in the hundreds of agencies, I should say, in divisions of agencies over the last 6 to 12 months, many have come back with the same challenges. And that's what led to this conference today, is we wanted to let you know what a lot of conferences, what a lot of the agencies are asking, and then we wanted to present these in a few question formats and then take you through a demonstration of how we're starting to address and solve these problems. So the first of that is how to determine the volume for digitization. So once a temporary record or permanent record has been determined, it's still sitting in an archive. So one of the questions is, how do we determine that volume? Well, there's a lot of tools that we can provide, both from an assessment perspective and some calculator tools that we can provide to have you do it yourself, or we can aid you to do that. Now, in this age of COVID-19, we know that it's a challenge for everyone, and a lot of these services can be done remotely. So we encourage you to let us help you with that. Another challenge is how to incorporate different file plans. So years ago, it used to be a single enterprise file plan for an agency, but more and more the agencies are looking to become more distributed. So if we have file plans for different divisions across the country, how do we get those divisions to buy into an enterprise approach? And one of the ways to do that is allow them to keep their own distinct file plans, but still be part of an overall enterprise plan. The next question is how to manage and standardize the assessment nationally and locally. So if we have a headquarters office, but all the records are stored across the nation, those are a lot of questions. So again, the team on the phone has done this many, many times. It's what we do every day, all day. And there's a lot of best practices and tools that we can provide. So how do you standardize that entire digitization process? So you want to include in that both documents that are born digital, right? Like if a fax comes in and it's stored digitally, or emails are coming in and things like that. How do you digitize or take those documents that are either born digital or have to be scanned? So within the scanning, you have to prep them, scan them, index them. You have to add all the appropriate NARA indexing requirements, and then you have to deliver them to a back-end system. So again, there are processes in place to do that, and we're going to share those with you a little bit later. How do you create a streamlined way to auto-classify the documents? So the better the preparation is up front with scanning or taking documents that are already born digital and doing some classification there, the easier it's going to be to put that information into a records management solution, both as a back file as well as a day forward solution. So another question is, which is really one we're going to focus on today, and Russ is going to spend a lot of time on that, is how to provide flexibility. So again, years ago, it was let's bring everything into a centralized system like SharePoint. Now many agencies are saying, well, we have Box, and we have legacy ECM systems, and we have file shares, and we also have SharePoint. So how do we store the content natively in all of these systems, but at the same time, let our senior agency officials for records management and our records officers, let them know where the content resides. So again, it's a challenge that we can help you address. And then the final question is, how do you provide a day forward solution to manage this? It's simple and it's easy to use, and it works within a COVID-19 and an M1921 business environment. So those are all questions that we're going to address as we move forward. So there's kind of two slides we're going to share with you now before the demonstration. So this slide is a little bit more about a strategic framework. So what's driving this change? So in many federal agencies, there's through M1921 and through M1218, which preceded it, there's an increased pressure to reduce the federal footprint. So many federal agencies with offices across 50 states are looking to downsize, consolidate those records. At the same time, they're looking to close those agency operated facilities for paper. NARA doesn't want anybody operating these facilities. There's also a push to move to the cloud and reduce that footprint. And at the same time, people now need to identify those permanent records, temporary records, and long-term records, and create a strategy for getting all of this content to NARA by the end of December 2022 in a digital form, because after that time, NARA will no longer accept those paper records. So the records officers and a lot of the senior officials are now reaching out and starting to get a little nervous about how to do this. So there's a lot of companies out there that do one piece of this, but the team you're talking to today does all of it. We've been in this paper to cloud framework and this area of business for many, many, many years. So what we're sharing with you today is what we've been doing to help federal agencies address this problem. So all these pressures funnel towards the middle. So as part of that, how do we help you educate your senior officials on how big the problem is? And we do that by assessing the challenge, both permanent records, temporary records, where are they stored, volumes, et cetera. We want to document but document that process and document those volumes and those challenges. Then we want to generate an action plan to solve that problem. So before you can determine what the record strategy is, you have to determine the volume of records and the retention schedules, address the file plans, talk to IT about security and governance, and a lot of the areas like that. And finally, you need to execute. So that plan or edge is what we use to form that strategic framework. So that kind of leads to the methodology of doing a readiness assessment. So let's take a look at that current state. Where are we? What is the end state of December 2022? We always recommend a pilot. And the reason we recommend a pilot is that we need to validate these assumptions. So for example, let's say we have a collection of 50,000 records and it's 200,000 to 300,000 pages. We put the file plan together. We take a look at the NARA required metadata. We scan all this content. We want to take that, ingest that into, say, in this case, a back end of SharePoint, set up the records management system, and making sure the entire process flows. If we need to modify that content, we can do so at any time during the pilot. But when we get to the conversion and implementation program, which will follow this, and we're doing millions of records, we want to make sure that there aren't a whole lot of questions. So that pilot mitigates the risk to the federal agency. It also helps our team make sure that we are addressing all the needs of that federal agency and we're doing everything correctly. And then finally, all that information is going to be delivered to NARA electronically, all within the guidelines of M1921. And we will at the same time have set up a day-forward solution to ensure that agencies don't recreate this problem and recreate the paper challenge again. Go ahead, Pat. So how do we go about doing that? So from the conversion and the implementation side, there are a number of different options. And this is kind of key to understand. This is where a lot of the agencies are having challenges. But there's as we talked about with the framework in the previous slide, the conversion and implementation process will help you address that. So the pictures at the top there, you'll see there are 3 different types of scanners. From an offsite perspective, if we're doing it at one of our facilities around the country and we've done that pilot, we can now do very, very high volume conversions in the millions of pages per week. And all that information can be scanned, can be indexed to NARA and go into a back-end system. If we're doing something on-site at your federal agency, and that can be 5, 10, or 20 different sites simultaneously, we bring a different set of scanners, and the entire process that we do offsite is the identical process we do on-site. Just sometimes the volumes can be a little bit different because on-site we can normally only work an 8-hour day, and an off-site capacity we can work 16 to 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. And the final picture there is a day-forward scanner, so a desktop scanner. So we want to make sure that whatever we design to get rid of your legacy back file, we're also setting you up to scan that content and index it day forward to make sure you're not recreating the problem. Because again, by January 1st, 2023, NARA doesn't want to receive the paper. So we have to help you make sure that you don't recreate it. So all that content is going to be indexed according to the NARA metadata requirements. We're waiting on some advanced guidance now, but there's primarily 5 to 7 metadata fields that they require to help make sure that when it is transferred to NARA, it is discoverable in their systems. So let's take a look at that. When we're doing that on-prem or cloud-based records management solution, what's important? We want to import and auto-classify that content. Now we want to apply the records management rules based on your file plan. And remember, that can be at an enterprise basis or it can be at a regional basis within your office. Providing reporting and audit trails is very, very important to this. Records officers want to know who's accessing content and should they be doing that, or do we need to add rules? We want to provide day-forward real-time ingestion, faxes, emails coming into the system. If you have film and fiche and other types of records, if there's books, ledgers, contracts, HR documents, how are we making sure that if those content is born digital, that it's being ingested correctly? And then finally, we want to prepare those records for a NARA transfer. And again, we'll speak to that. But now that all this information has been gathered and all the records management rules have been applied, where do we want to now store the content? 5 or 10 years ago, as records management was becoming kind of more prevalent in the federal agencies, they would store them in a back-end system, document them, or open text or things like that. But now many of these agencies want to have a varied approach. File shares have gained in a lot of popularity across federal agencies. Many agencies have SharePoint and are moving to Office 365 and SharePoint Online. Box has some very high secure FedRAMP high storage facilities that offer agencies a lot of options there. And again, there are a legacy ECM system still out there. So we want, from an agency perspective, to give you the greatest flexibility and allow you to store all this content in your back-end native system, but still give the records officers the ability to manage it all centrally. That gives them the ability to report NARA compliance. So I hope this is kind of giving you a good idea of how this process works. So we'd rather now take you to a live demonstration and show you how we do scan that paper, how we apply all these business rules, then at the same time we ingest it into Gimmel to apply all these records management best practices. I'll turn it over now to Scott Money.
All right, thank you, Mike. So yeah, again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We know that many of you have seen several scanning demos, but we still do want to keep that piece in this. It's obviously a critical part of identifying your records and processing them to their assigned destination. I want to get back to one thing that Mike mentioned, and that is the prep process. So when we're getting ready to scan these documents, there's several key things that come into play. And it relates to the way we identify that content and any way we can streamline that process. Keep in mind, I think we mentioned also earlier that this is not just about paper. This can include CDs. Many of you probably have those CDs in your file cabinet with scanned records or images, DVDs, CDs, DVDs, also fiche. So you may have converted some microfiche, and you may even have some of that content on external drives. So regardless of what that source is, we can still follow through with this process. The other thing I wanted to mention are network drives. So although you can process some of that content through a capture solution, you don't necessarily have to do that because there's different ways to manage that content as it is in place. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So what I'm going to walk through is a simulation with scanning paper. So when we get into the scanning of paper, we have three key areas we need to focus on. It is the separation. So separation relates to when a document starts and when it stops. So what's the first and last page? There's also classification. So what is that document type and what's the easiest way to identify that document type? So if we start from the basic method, let me just share a separator here with you real quick. So a patch sheet or a barcode separator, you'll see the bars at the top, the 4 bars represent a method of separation. The barcode in this case represents a way to classify the document. So in this example, I use this page as the cover page. So this tells me when the first page is and what is that document type based on the barcode. As we move to the next phase, we have to apply metadata, and we'll get to that as soon as I get through the part here about the scanning and how do we do that. So before we get to that validation, we can also separate purely on barcode. We could separate purely on a patch code. We can even separate on the contents of a page or its structure. So there's several different ways to do that, but again, choosing the right method that streamlines that process is what we want to focus on. So as we go through this capture process, in this example I mentioned, we use those barcode separators. So I created 3 documents and I have my separation, everything's identified. I'm going to go ahead and close this. All right, I'm going to go to my next phase, which is applying the metadata. So in our recent visits, we found we were in some records rooms and we were pulling some folders, scanning some samples, and we noticed that there's a barcode typically on that folder. And we got into further discussions and realized, well, that barcode actually represents that record somewhere else in another database. So rather than go through the process of keying all this information, we're going to do a lookup. So In this case, we're going to do a barcode number, which was a sticker, which then gives me my contract number, also the company name, task number, if it applies. And we have all our fields here that are filled out automatically for us. So our keying is drastically reduced. You can also do zonal extraction and more advanced platforms, but you know, again, it all depends on what your paper looks like and basically how it's stored. So this is a very common method as how we process these documents. So we'll go ahead and go through these. We'll go through each one and get our barcode number in our correct date area here and process through our items. We're doing 3 in this case. And sometimes we also find you don't have to show all these fields. Behind the scenes, I can have 15 field items here. Maybe that's my requirements, but whatever I need from the metadata has to match what my rules are on the back-end system. Whether that's a box environment, maybe it's a network drive, maybe it's a SharePoint site. So we have to make sure we follow those rules of retention. And basically, these are the first few steps to get to that point. All right. So at this point, we've processed our 3 documents. And when we combine what we've done so far, we have our identification. We know what the document type is. We're going to output our format as a PDF, and we're going to send the metadata required to our back-end system. And then that's going to go into our environment where our rules are already created for our retention policy. So we followed all those requirements up front before we pass it back to our next phase, which is the export into the Ecm system. So again, it doesn't matter. It doesn't all have to be in one system anymore. Like Mike said, you used to always have to put everything in one container to manage it. That's not the case anymore. And we'll lead that in with what Russ is going to show us here next. So that's basically my piece of this. If you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll address those at the end of the session. And Russ, I'm going to go ahead and pass this to you. So what we'll be doing is picking up on the management side of the content, how we're managing the content.
Thank you, Scott, and hello, everyone. I'm going to pull my screen up. So based on what you just saw with Scott as far as preparing those documents, scanning those, and releasing those, in this case, what was done is he released those to a SharePoint M365 team site document library. So here what we're able to do, we're taking advantage of repositories that you've already invested in. Documents that were scanned have been stored with all the associated metadata. And this ends up enhancing the end user experience as fields are already populated. There's no user intervention as far as having to populate any metadata on these values. And the end user can take full advantage of the designated repository where these documents have been scanned to. So as you can see, the 3 contracts, we can see the document and the M365 sites. All of the associated metadata values are here. And end users, again, this experience can now be enhanced from that experience. They can take advantage of things like search or filtering, all out of the box of the repository where those end users are designated to work out of. And again, this in the case of scanning documents, again, the burden of users having to upload documents, apply that metadata, that is not existent here with documents that have been scanned in, as we can see all of those values here. So what we can do from a records management perspective is, since these documents were scanned and these keyword properties are there, we can take advantage of Gimmel's records management solution, which is a manage in-place solution. So I'm going to go ahead and flip over to Gimmel's records management of how we can effectively apply retention and classification to these examples of these contracts that are scanned to a M365 site. So what you're seeing here is Gimmel's records management solution. Right away, we can see those contracts that were scanned in right away. And although at the document repository level, we call those contracts, right away, based on that metadata information, we can classify these automatically based on a centralized file plan that we're managing. And because we're managing these in place, the Gimmel records management solution is certified against a universal ERM requirement. So at the point of capture, we know something about these based on the file plan that we're managing here. We can also manage content in other locations as well. Again, if you have repositories out in your file shares, SharePoint on-prem, SharePoint online, all of that can be managed within one interface. So again, records managers have one location where they can work through classifying and applying retention policies to all content regardless of where that sits. So I'm going to go down a little further on the actual content that was actually scanned in, and we can see the 3 contracts from the SharePoint Online site. Right away, records managers can note that these exist out in the SharePoint Online repository. By clicking on further details, we can also see from the policies that we've applied, we've tied this back to a particular record class. In this case, we have a class called Pub 502 General Contracts. Records managers never have to leave the platform in order to understand if they're classifying content appropriately and if policies are being applied. We're also provided with a link where if records managers have access, they can actually view that content from here. So records managers no longer have to hop out to various repositories such as the file share, SharePoint, Box in order to manage these records effectively. It can all be done from this location. We also are presented with a visual representation of the actual retention lifecycle that has been applied. So again, right away, we declare these as records, and what that means, again, we're managing this content where it resides today. So they were scanned, in this case, to a M365 document library team site. From those property values that we collect, the content stays there. We're able to declare that item as a record. So what we're able to do is we're able to lock that down so we can protect the integrity, make that record immutable so no changes can be made, and we can manage that content from the point of capture all the way through the disposition process. In this case, what we can see is we've declared it as a record, declared it right away, and we're going to retain that for 3 years beyond the contract end date. So in this case, once that disposition period has been met, we can send out a notification for those approvers to go through an approval process, and once those approvals have been performed, we can actually dispose of that record from where it sits today. One point Mike brought up earlier, which we'll be touching on as well, is we can also support transfers. In the case of permanent records, where you may have to transfer those to the National Archives, we can also send out a notification where we go through a transfer process as well. And what's involved with a transfer process is that we can actually send out a notification, and upon the transfer, set up a staging location to where those files can be staged along with the appropriate metadata and a CSV file, to where we can support that transfer based on how you're transferring your records today. You may be using a tool such as ERA, maybe there's another tool, but again, we can facilitate the staging of those files to make those transfers a little easier to support. Once we transfer those files, we do what we do there is once notification from the National Archives that those files have been received, we can send out another notification which will take care of the actual disposition process once we've gotten notification that the National Archives has received those files appropriately. But again, all from one location, a manage in place approach, regardless of where those documents and records are being stored, we have that ability to manage from a central dashboard against a centralized file plan. Just to further some additional details what we're able to do here, and again, this is all automatic to the records manager. It's seamless. Again, the content's captured. We're able to, based on classification rules, we're able to assign a record class to that. And we're able to do that via what we call properties. So we can take those properties, those are the values as far as what information is available. In this case, there's contracts that were scanned to the SharePoint site. And based on those property values, we get not only information property values such as the create date, the file date that are populated automatically, but any additional information that in this case, as those documents scanned and stored, we get additional information such as the content type, the metadata values, and the metadata values, of course, in this case, were driven from the scan process. As those documents were being scanned in, that auto lookup from the barcode being populated, ultimately that content being stored, we are able to store that information automatically. That is stored along with that document. And in Gimmel Records Management case, what we're able to do is create a classification based on any combination of these of the values that we've received here. In this case, I looked at the content type, and we can also base our retention values off of the property values as well. In the case here, I'm basing a retention off of the end date. So again, this was made available as part of the scan process. That end date value was populated. In Gimmel's records management, we can seamlessly set up a rule to where we can base a value off of a date value, any other combination of property values as well. But in this case, we're using end date, where we're maintaining this for 3 years beyond this date. Gimmel also provides a audit trail, so any action taken over the course of the life cycle, we're able to track. So any action, once this document has been scanned, any action that's taken against that record, we also record that in the form of an audit trail, which can be reported against as well. So we're able to do this via a centralized file plan that we maintain. So as content's being stored, again, we're going to automatically tie that back to a record class. Again, we can see other categories or other repositories where we're managing content. In this case, we're looking at SharePoint Online. And just one other thing to point out, over here to the right, we have a classified versus unclassified. Again, this monitoring dashboard that's made available to records managers, they can actively see what we're capturing appropriately, what may not be getting captured in this pie chart over to the right. Under classified, we can see that all of the documents, or all of the documents content that we see here, we can see that we've classified this appropriately. So based on our rules, we know that we've effectively been able to successfully classify that. We've been able to potentially apply a policy. And the other piece of the pie chart under unclassified, that represents everything that we have not been able to identify. So in this case of these scanned documents, if we happen to miss a piece of metadata, or if an end user uploaded a document and a piece of metadata was not applied appropriately, or if the location is not in the appropriate location, that will show up as unclassified, or what we refer to as unidentified. So records managers right away, by landing into the monitor area, they can see what we're not capturing appropriately. So in most cases where we're capturing content in the form of scanners, we're going to ensure upfront most of that is captured. But again, from a enterprise records management standpoint, we may have other areas where we need to ensure that that is being captured appropriately as well. And those are just some examples where that an item may show up as unclassified if we've designated rules where we're looking for a particular piece of metadata in order to apply a classification rule to that. How we're able to do this is through a centralized file plan. So basically we have a file plan, and the file plan, again, based on the type organization we're dealing with, a lot of times this can be a general record schedule that you're maintaining. We have methods of working with our services as far as ingesting your file plan, so there's not as much configuration that you have to do on the front end, but we're able to set up our file plan in a centralized location in a centralized way, and from here, we can set up a hierarchical plan for you to go out and maintain your file plan. File plan consists of classification rules in our case, the life cycle as far as how long we're going to keep that content for. In this case, we're working with contract files. I've set up a particular record class for that under my code pub 502 general contracts. To the end user, again, they may be working in an area where they just refer to it as contracts, but from a records management standpoint, we have to tie this back to a formal schedule that we may be maintaining. We can see that I've applied classification rules in a life cycle. By going into my classification rules, I can see I've set up a very basic rule based on those property values that I've captured. In this case, I'm looking at a SharePoint Online site, and if it's in a particular folder, I'm classifying it to a specific, I'm looking for a specific value in order to tie it back to this particular record class. And again, the rules are very flexible. Based on those property values that are captured, we can set that up in our classification rules engine. Based on information being captured, we can match that, we can analyze that data, match it up against a classification rule, and apply a record class classification to that. We also maintain our lifecycle rules here as well. So based on that classification, upon successful classification, I should say, we can apply the associated lifecycle. In this case, I've applied a lifecycle that's looking at the end contract end date, and we're going out 3 years. And based on that value, we're going to go through a disposition process. Once a disposition process is met, We can send out notifications. That's not necessarily required, but if you do require notifications, we can send out that to any number of approvers that you require. You may require an item to go to a business owner first, and maybe it goes to that person's manager and ultimately a records manager to approve of that. We maintain a inbox for our notifications where we can track any item that requires an action. And those actions can be a number of things. It could be a notification for an actual record declaration. It could be for disposition and delete like you see here. It could also be set up to support a transfer. So if you do have permanent records where you require those records to be transferred to the National Archives, we can set out a notification which in turn will help stage those documents. Again, it would go through a transfer state, then ultimately a disposition state in that case, so that we can, again, we'll disposition those files once we've been assured those files have been successfully transferred to NARA. Our transfers, we typically, out of the box, we look at staging those documents, but again, based on your requirements, we can automate that further based on how far along, how much automation you want to add there. But what we find typically with federal agencies, different tools can be utilized. A lot of times we come across the ERA utility, but again, we can work with you based on what your transfer requirements are. So again, active monitoring that we're able to do, we can maintain that through a centralized file plan. All information that we collect, again, we take a manage in place approach, so your content remains where it has been captured. We never pick up your content from a records management perspective and move that. It stays where it is. We're able to take action, manage that entire life cycle. And we can also report against the information we collect as well. So a lot of times, it's not, as documents are being maintained across their life cycle, we need to know something about those files. So we provide many reports out of the box. A lot of these are very records management centric. We can generate your file plan and send that off in a report. We can look at items that are approaching phase expiration. So before a notification is kicked out to support a potential disposition or transfer, we can also report on any phase of any of your record classes that we're maintaining. All of our reports that we provide can be exported as well. I'll go through one of the reports, just an example of some of the reports that we can maintain. In this case, I have a file plan report. We click on any one of our reports, it's generated real time. As those reports are generated, presented within our web browser, we can also export those out to a more familiar format. So PDF, CSV, in the case of if we had to support a transfer to NARA, again, we can create these reports if there's a particular CSV file that has to be produced to support those transfers. And again, all of our reports within our solution, you can export out to another format. A lot of times what we find here are file plans that need to go out for formal approval before a retention schedule is updated. We may send this out in a PDF format to get approval. Once those approvals have been received, we can adjust those retention schedules as needed. We also support other functions from a records management standpoint. We support search. So again, all of the records that we're maintaining, regardless of repositories that they may be sitting in, we can search, provide a federated search across all the records that we're managing. So although your content records, they may reside out in M365, SharePoint Online, file shares, records managers have a way of searching, we provide a federated search so that records managers can search across all those repositories. And based on your search results, you can take further action on those as well. So again, we provide many type searches. We can search across individual files. We can search across record classes. We even support the ability to set up legal holds. So again, all of these capabilities are provided within the Gimmel Records Management Solution across all of your repositories where you're storing content. So that is pretty much what I was going to go through from a demonstration standpoint. At this point, again, very high-level overview as far as capabilities. In this example, the fact that we were able to scan documents directly to in this case, a SharePoint site. Automatically, we're able to take those property values, assign record classes based on a centralized file plan that we're maintaining. Upon that successful classification, we can apply an associated retention rule. and ultimately maintain that throughout the entire life cycle. Again, we don't have to, it's just not records that we manage here. We can also manage your non-records as well, but the focus today are records meeting the M1921 mandate directive. And we can also support the transfers as well, again, based on your retention rules that you have. So on that note, what I'm going to do is stop the share and I'm going to hand it back over. So I'm going to stop my share here and hand it off.
Great. Thanks, Russ.
So I'll take,
Mike?
I'll take this one. So we want to just go through some quick summary of benefits of what we've shown you today. And we already have a number of questions that have come in, and we want to get to those quickly in our last 20 minutes. So looking at this kind of holistically, the idea behind today was to understand this is not a difficult process if you're working with somebody who does this kind of every day, all day. So our final messaging to you on this is we want you to think of this as a simplified solution so your end users can scan documents or upload those born digital documents, and that's whether they're working remotely, like everybody's doing through COVID, or whether they're working in the office or in the headquarters office or one of the offices around the country. The solution we're talking about today supports all types of data. When we go into the legacy archives, we see microfilm and fiche and audio tapes and videotapes. Again, all the way that we index that data and what Russ was talking about is all done after it's converted. Our services can handle all that. We're all talking about a streamlined search of organizational documents as well as search across enterprise repositories. That's why even though we store in Box or SharePoint or a file share, if we have all that metadata at an enterprise level with the right permission, you can access and search anything. We want to be able to support, again, that ability to scan and index from your home office, have an audit trail, and we want the system, most importantly, to be able to adapt with change. 6 months ago, nobody thought COVID was going to be here, but it's here and it's here to stay for a while. So in the same way we can adapt this system, we know that over time it's going to have to adapt as well. So having said that, Pat, I'll turn it over to you so we can get into the question and answer period.
Okay, great. So we've had a few come up here. One on scanning remotely. So Scott, perhaps this is a good one for you. Our agency is pushing all of us to work remotely. How do I ensure that documents I'm creating will get into this system with the correct metadata?
Good question. So, well, if we're scanning remotely, what we want to do is make sure we have a capture system that's going to be communicating directly with the ECM solution that team is using. So we typically want to avoid a 2 or 3 step process where we're scanning to a drive and then importing everything manually through another resource into the system. This day and age, there's plenty of solutions that have a light footprint that you can use if you're scanning from home, should someone be delivering you boxes, which some of you may have to do. There's plenty of solutions out there that'll handle that. So I think the key to that is just making sure you have a direct connection and you don't have middleware in between the scanning solution and the ECM environment.
Okay. Mike, we had a question about federal agencies that have classified or highly confidential information that need to follow strict records management rules. What is the best way to handle these records?
Yeah, I'll address that a couple different ways. From the document conversion standpoint, we've worked in those secure areas for many years with many of the agencies that you know. But different than traditional conversion processes, what we find is that we have to set up that on-site conversion process. Again, most of that is on-site, never off-site, and it's a closed system, meaning that we can't access any databases. Everything that we're doing is and sometimes it's a SCIF or it's just a secure environment. So we prep, we scan, we index, we do everything within defined environment without touching any network systems for that customer. And then oftentimes what we'll have to do is then we'll have to store that information on a secure drive, and then hand it off to an IT professional, if you will, within the organization, who then scans that data and uploads it into their back-end enterprise records management system. There are a number of additional security gates and protocols that you have to follow, although you have to follow security protocols for PII and PHI and other areas in a traditional conversion, they're just added compliance and security issues. And then also when it comes to the actual transfer of the data from the agency to NARA, again, it has to follow a lot of specific protocols. I just know, for example, in emails are not supposed to be encrypted and going to NARA, but if you're in the world of DoD, those emails are encrypted. So a lot of those are done on a one-off basis, depending on the specific security of the agency.
Okay, great. Russ, we have a question about how to ingest from files uploaded to Teams with correct metadata.
Sure. So the way that we can ingest files uploaded to Team with the correct metadata is very similar to scanning. Again, the scanning process was a little more automated. Those metadata values came along with the documents once it was stored in Teams. With what we're able to do with files is a very similar process with just a user, in this case, a user uploads a file, the metadata is there. Gimmel Records Management is looking at that information. So any metadata or content type, anything that has been configured at that team site, we're going to ingest that automatically. So based on those property values, we can auto-classify. Once we've classified, we can apply an associated retention schedule to that file. So not much different, but in this case, we're dependent upon a user, in this case, uploading and with the metadata that has been applied to that document that's been uploaded.
Okay, well, another one that's kind of off of this, we might as well pick it up as we go here. How does the file plan deal with event-based disposition dates, i.e. the retention doesn't start until an event happens, like the end of a mission or project?
Yep. So Gimmel Records Management supports event-based retention as well for those items that we just don't know when that event's going to occur, such as those examples provided. So two ways that we can kick off event-based retention. One can be, we can drive that from our interface as far as driving the event that we've set up, contract, end date. It can also be through our API, so a third-party system, line of business system, we can ingest that value through when that event kicks off, and we can automatically generate, based on that event that's being driven, can drive the retention based on that particular event. So we do support event as well as date-based and rule-based, but event-based retention is another area that we support as well.
Great. We got a lot of questions flying in here, so trying to keep up. So here's Scott, here's a couple that are related, I think. So can I scan remotely and then process the image file for indexing, categorization, etc. from a central site? And then adjunct to that is, can metadata be automatically generated or must it be manually entered? So first, scanning remotely, processing centrally, and then how to manage the metadata automatically or manually.
Yeah, definitely. If you're there's several solutions out there that'll do that. So some of them are remote scanning solutions. So basically, the capture process will take place at a remote site. Maybe a QC step will take place after that to ensure the integrity of the document. The processing central, you can definitely do that as well, especially if you're doing some kind of extraction, automated extraction. Or again, even if that document has a barcode, you can still use the barcode or some value on the, say, the first or second page or whatever page, do some kind of a lookup to automatically populate the rest of the metadata that should belong to that document. So that can all take place centrally by another group or largely automated. So yes, there's several ways to do that. It's a good question.
And then I guess that kind of flows right along there with the metadata being automatically generated.
Hey, Pat, let me jump in there. Something to add to what Scott said.
Yeah.
I think this also kind of goes back to what we talked about from doing a pilot. So, for example, if an agency is trying to scan content, even if it's by knowledge workers remotely, and they want to do things from a central site, one of the reasons we do that pilot is to help validate what we can scan and index dynamically, and what we can scan and index and might require manual intervention. And by doing that pilot, we may discern that half of that data can be automatically indexed and uploaded to the records management system, and other portions of it will require more intervention. And that helps us define cost and time frame, which helps the agency plan from a funding perspective.
Got it. Okay. We've been asked for a couple of follow-up things I think we can capture. What happens if paper records are not converted by December 31st, 2022? Well, that's an interesting question. I know there's a waiver process that agencies can go through, but you've got to figure out a way to get them off your site, right? And get them off to your own commercial storage. You're generally supposed to not have paper on your site by 2022. Is that correct, Mike?
And Pat, yeah, that's a great question. And I actually addressed this same question to the senior NARA officials at the last bridge meeting. And the answer was that NARA is not an enforcement organization. So if by the end of December, an agency is not fully compliant, they're not in a position to levy any fines. The idea of having to work with GSA with their combined schedules, right, and the GSA numbers there to make easy procurement, to have the White House get behind this and have NARA provide the guidance. They're trying to get all the agencies aligned to get there. They know that if they're not, they can't necessarily strip funding. But we've been told that the idea is that just like M1218 provided guidance, and this is providing guidance, as the agencies move closer, they can apply, as you mentioned, they can apply for a waiver, but they want the agencies to show that they're making progress and not just kicking the proverbial can down the road in the hopes that the problem will go away, because it will not.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Well, there's a couple big questions in here that are basically fit for their own webinar, so only might have to follow up. How do you compare Gimmel records management with Microsoft's records management using labels with OneDrive, SharePoint, Online Exchange, Office 365? And yeah, that's a big question. Probably can't tackle it in a matter of 6 or 8 minutes here, so we may have to follow up with you on that one. I mean, generally speaking, as you saw today, we leverage, Gimmel is, obviously a Microsoft partner. We leverage Microsoft's capabilities, but beyond what you're seeing in Microsoft 365, obviously, as we showed today, Gimmel, we can work with your content and records in repositories outside that environment, such as Box and file shares, etc. And there's some other aspects to it that we're happy to share with you. Follow up to an earlier one on the scanning aspect. Is there forms recognition and data extraction capabilities, including hand-printed data?
So, yeah, if the question is, does it exist? Yes, there is. You can do forms recognition. It's a more advanced solution, and that's definitely something that is available. And that's a means of just basically training a system to recognize a page and assigning a document type, and of course extracting the metadata once it identifies that document type. So yeah, definitely. The handwriting, so we've been doing this for a very, very long time. There are products out there that do a good job of handwriting recognition. I can tell you though, it's the one thing you can't control. When you try it, it's hard enough to get someone to fill in a box printing. But when you're talking about general ICR, we've had mixed results with it. So the technology, yes, it's there. The results, it's better, like you mentioned, Pat, you're almost getting to a pilot situation like that with that, and gathering a small sample of documents and trying it out.
Got it. Yep. I think we're going to have to, there's a couple more in here, but I'm thinking we should probably jump to wrap up. We can always stay a few minutes after if anybody else has questions, but we're going to be pushing up against the top of the hour. So I'm going to suggest, Mike, that we move on to our next steps, and then we're happy to stay on for a few extra minutes as needed if people have additional questions.
Great, thanks, Pat. I must say, in the questions that were coming in through the Q&A, I was pleasantly surprised at the depth of the questions, which tells me that a lot of federal agencies that were watching this event today have been thinking hard and long about this process. And keep in mind that as an organization, as a team, we're literally doing this every day. So all the questions that we're able to answer and those that we are not, Pat and I and the team will get back to you and provide a written response for that. One question that was on there too was about a copy of the deck. We will make the deck available. Both Gimmel and DocPoint will make this deck available, and we want you to use these slides in any internal presentations that you have. This isn't information that was just, we found on the web and put it on slides. We've been doing this for many, many years, and this is a culmination of a lot of that research. So from a next step perspective, some of the other questions that were coming in via chat, or how can we kind of spend a little time with you guys and understand a little bit more about this process and share with you some of the challenges we're facing within our agency. So we want to provide that virtual of assessment, and it's a few hours of time for both the Gimmel team and the DocPoint team. We'd love to get on the phone with you. We love to do WebExes or Zoom meetings and take a look at some of your records management challenges and file plans. Many people ask us about guidelines for determining the volume of permanent records eligible for digitization. There's a lot of best practices and tools that we've developed over the years that we can share with you. And keep in mind too, in the event of COVID, we can remote in. We don't have to be on site. If there's even anybody on site at a headquarters or a facility, you can walk us around, let us take a look at documents. Our teams can look at that and answer questions. And then finally is providing you guidance on how to meet these guidelines. What we find from the senior agency officials in the agencies is when they're asked, they have to provide concrete plans on how do I get there and what method and means do I get there. So from procurement all the way through delivery, our team is prepared to help you. And we hope that after this event, you'll reach out to us, to Pat's team or my team, and let us know what your challenges are, and let us know what we can do to help. Also, we're having an event on June 30th, which we'll also send out, that will be addressing many of these issues and more about narrow readiness and helping you and your agency get ready for M1921 compliance. And we'll provide more information a little bit down the road on that as a follow-up email. Pat?
Great, thanks, Mike. So here's contact information for Mike and myself. If you have some interest in having us get together with you, we're happy to do so. Just shoot us an email, give us a call. You can also just throw it in the chat box if you'd like us to follow up. And we'll be following up with links, etc., to this event. So if you can give it some thought over the next few days, you can always reply back to those links that we're sending out as well to ask for some help. We have just a couple minutes left, so I think we're a wrap for the formal presentation. And if you guys want to stick around for a couple more minutes, I can look at see if we get any additional questions in.
Hey, Pat, I think there was a follow-up on the question about the teams ingesting content from teams. And
yeah, I see that.
The question was there's not metadata. You know, when you store a document in Team, let's say you put it in a SharePoint library, you choose your library to drop it into. Yeah, that's true. We have seen groups that when they choose the library they dump into, maybe there's a workflow in the back end that may append some additional metadata somewhere else. But there are solutions from the ingestion piece into a capture solution that will actually pull those libraries if you want to do some additional processing. I think Russ answered the question as far as ingesting into a records management perspective. Let's say it's a SharePoint list or library, I should say. So yeah, you can do that from both perspectives. I hope I answered that question.
Yep, great, thanks. We've been asked, Russ, if they have access to Gimmel's backend database to allow for custom reports like SQL Server, report engines, Power BI, that kind of
Yes,
thing.
we store the information. Again, we have our canned reports and we include a runtime report writer, but it is built on a Windows stack, SQL Server, so you're free to utilize any report writer, reporting engine, Power BI being one of those, and you can certainly utilize that information to report additional information, report against that information we store. Absolutely.
Got it. So there are just a couple more left here, actually. One was around, has the Paper Reduction Act played a role in electronic records management process? Well, I can say it certainly comes up quite often as we're working with clients. We obviously also see it in a lot of formal requests for proposals and these types of things. So I believe that's been a guidance, or provides guidance in terms of people moving to electronic. But it's, in my opinion, it's basically played into the other follow-on directives that are pushing for the same objective, and that is to get out of paper and get into electronic. Mike, any
Pat,
other
this is
thoughts
Mike.
there?
Yeah, just to add to that is, I think in some ways the Paperwork Reduction Act has helped agencies to move towards a more born digital environment.
Mm-hmm.
I think the downside to that is I think the records officers in many ways have been left behind and have had these long-standing paper archives that have been left unaddressed. And now as a result of M1921, they're having to address this. So they have to do two things. They got to make sure that the day forward processes are in good working order, but now they got to go back and take all the permanent records and get them digitized, and then find the money to do that, and the time and the process, and then get senior leadership to buy in. And I think that's some of the challenges that agencies are facing, because they have been kicking that can down the road for so long that now in some ways the process is overwhelming to many of those agency record officers.
Great. So I think we had one last one. I just noticed when I bubbled up clear to the top here. We're probably going to need a bit more information on this, but what are the key components of a shared service organization records management process?
And I can try to take an initial stab at that, Pat. So I think in some of the larger federal agencies like NIH, for example, they have a shared service center, and they may have 150 or 200 shared applications that sit in a centralized IT environment, and then allow the different component agencies just to access that content. I think the short answer is, from the RM perspective, it's not a problem, but it depends on how it is licensed. And if it's and then Pat, to your side, if it's licensed by the amount of content, or it's by license number of concurrent users or named users, I don't think it's an issue from the licensing side. I think oftentimes the challenge with shared service organizations is how you charge, right? How do you charge back, by content or by storage or by license? So I think it's something that can be done. I just think we have to be very specific about what does that shared service organization framework look like, and then how can we work backwards to make this solution work within it?
Yep. And we had a recent discussion with an agency looking at this, and one of the challenges they had was shared services normally is defined as centralized, right? So with a decentralized way of managing records, they were trying to come to grips with, do we need to move all of these electronic and eventually digitized to electronic records into a central repository, or can we effectively help components or agencies within a department manage these records distributed in their actual native locations and repositories, right? So what we bring to the table really is a centralized view of distributed enterprise records, and they were trying to get their arms around how to your point, Mike, license for that, and then how do they support it, through their shared service. So the components are there, but it is a bit of a different definition to how some of these shared service centers may have looked at how they deploy historically. So I think that is it, everyone. I think we got them all. We'll go back through these questions and those that presented them to us. If we can find some additional information, we'll provide it. And once again, we really appreciate everyone's time today and hope you found it to be worthwhile. Have a great day.